the way Confucianism influenced the Chinese government. Confucianism was started by a man known as Master Kong, which translated from Latin was Confucius. Confucius was born in 551 BCE. His teachings were mainly to help the government and society run effectively and humanely. During his time, Confucius um, was known as the first great moralist and was a political advisor to the courts of Zhou. Um, during that time that he was living in, which inspired him to uh, have his philosophical work. Um, he lived during a time of a lot of disorder in the government and society itself. Um, Confucius' philosophical teachings, he believed that Tao, meaning the way, which is what he believed was the universal order, was the way to have a morally and morally effective government and society. Uh, he was known as China's first great moralist, um, and he died in 479 BCE. His students would continue teaching his philosophical teachings. Mencius and Zunzi continued spreading his uh, philosophy and adding to Confucianism when he died. Um, Confucius' teachings were all about that, how to have society function morally, down to uh, just the common person up to the ruler. Um, Confucius can uh, Confucianism can show how a government should function morally and correctly in his eyes. The ruler, for example, was known later in time, were known as the sons of heaven. They were responsible for how the country was supposed to go, and to show that they were, humble and responsible leaders. Um, he believed that it started at the top, so the rulers had to be humble and very forgiving, and that would trickle down to the rest of society. Um, it didn't start until 200 years later, until Confucianism was really used in any part of ancient Chinese history. Um, the emperor who installed it into a Confucian state was Emperor Han Wudi, who declared it a Confucian state and banned all other ideologies so that everybody could function under this society. Um, he was one of the longest reigning emperors in Chinese history for about 54 years. Before the Han uh, dynasty, it was the Qin dynasty. They banned Confucianism and burned all of the books, and only fragments and pieces were used during this time because most of them were burned. Um, Confucianism used fragments of Taoist and legalist principles for the roles of higher up officials. Before Confucianism, people didn't have a choice but to work one job. This way that the government and society were used um, was giving people the ability to move up or move out of the job that they have with written exams, and anybody was able to apply for a new job if they passed the exam and the higher official elected them to their place. There were positives about Confucianism for sure, such as allowing people to move up in the world and also having the principles and ideals to have uh, everybody the ability to have education. Um, but there were some negatives. Some of the negatives were that women were treated as objects. They were um, put last in the familiar order. It went son and father first, and then everybody else at the bottom. Um, so they always had to listen to the man in the house, whether if it was the father, of course they'd have to listen to their father. And then once they were married, they had to listen to everything that their husbands would ask of them. And then if the husband died, the eldest son would have domain over this woman, even though that it was his mother. Um, the when the Han Dynasty ended, it was a couple dynasties later where the Tang Dynasty brought back Confucianism, but a new type of Confucianism known as Neo-Confucianism. Um, Neo-Confucianism came along by the pioneers Han Yu and Liao. They used the original messages and methods of Confucianism and then added Buddhist and Taoist concepts, or left some of the teaching of Buddhism out, such as the Buddhism believes that they don't know everything, but uh, in Neo-Confucianism they believe that you're able to obtain knowledge and to understand reality and how the world works. Um, Neo-Confucianism had a great deal of respect to having the ability for people to move up in the world with the civil service exam. The civil service exam was based on the philosophical teachings and were, if you were able to pass the exam, you were able to move up and work into the government of of the Tang Dynasty and also the Song Dynasty. Um, and that is it. And here are my sources. Thank you very much.